Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu.
Shalom, Reb Brian Yosef here. In this episode, we're going to explore the two polarities of the thinking mind in relation to becoming more conscious. So the act of thinking can either draw us into more ego and into feeling more stuck, which really means feeling stuck in our thoughts and feelings, although when we are stuck, we're hardly aware of that. Or thinking can bring us to the threshold of awakened consciousness, which means knowing ourselves as consciousness, knowing ourselves as the open space within which all experience is coming and going. So if we want to use the thinking mind to lead us away from stuckness and help to lead us into that spaciousness and inner freedom, it's helpful to have a nuanced understanding of the different types of thoughts that we engage in and how each of them can be used in the right way. To do this, we will explore the 5 basic levels of thought and how they can each function as portals of presence. Enjoy. I want to start with a little teaching by the Maggid of Mezrish, the Hasidic master. He was said to comment once that in his time, he said nowadays, of course the nowadays was a few hundred years ago, but it applies equally well to now, this teaching. He says nowadays the divine presence is actually more accessible to us, more available to us, more intimate with us than in the time when the Holy Temple stood. Now, you have to understand that kind of, to say something like that is a very chutzpahdik kind of opposite teaching from a lot of what happens in the tradition. If you don't know that part, then you might just think, oh, this is just a common Jewish idea that he's saying. It's actually the opposite of, as were a lot of Hasidic things, not because they were trying to contradict the traditional teaching, but because all spiritual teachings, as I've said many times, come in the form of paradox, meaning there's a teaching and then there's the opposite teaching, and they're both true, but they're both true in relation to particular situations. Often the situations are not external situations, but our internal situation. In other words, what thought do we need to contemplate right now in order to bring us back into balance, into alignment, into, if we want to get technical with it, to bring us out of identification with ego and into identification with who we are on the deepest level. So these are all teachings are thoughts. They're forms of thought which either help us or don't help us. And that's what we're going to talk about today, actually, are different types of thought. But first, back to his teaching. So what he said is, nowadays, the divine presence is much more accessible to us. And he told a parable. He said, imagine there was a king whose land was conquered, and so they were forced to go into exile. And as the king was wandering around, disguised as a beggar because he didn't want the enemies to know that he was the king, he was taken in to the house of some people of modest means, not what the king was used to, not the usual palace with all the servants and all that stuff, but just someone's little house. And he came in and they received him with respect and with kindness, and he relaxed and he chatted to them intimately, just as he used to do with those who were in his court, his most inner circle. And he said, that's what the divine presence is like. It's wandering around in exile, but it comes into our humble abodes and chats with us just as it once did in the palace. But when it was in the palace, meaning the temple, like when the temple existed, it wasn't accessible to us because not everybody is in there in the temple and so on. So he's giving a teaching that has a particular Jewish context to it because it's in the context of the idea of the ancient temple and Jewish history and so on. But the teaching itself is actually very universal and very applicable no matter what background you come from, no matter whether you know about the temple or not, because it's really about the simple fact that the reality that we call the divine presence is not something remote. It's something intimately available to us all the time in all things if we know how to access it. And which is why it's so important when we talk about religious concepts that come to us from the tradition that other people have talked about in the past. It's crucial that we make the connection between that and something that we can access in our own experience. Otherwise, it's not real. Otherwise, it's just ideas in our minds. So the root of being able to access that divine presence or not being able to access it, the root of it really lies in thought. That doesn't mean that thought is the same thing as accessing it. It's just that thought can lead us in the right direction or the wrong direction, or to put it more, maybe not right and wrong, but to lead us in a direction of more experiential connection with being or reality or presence and what we call the divine presence, or it can kind of block us. Thought can hinder us and lead us in the direction of feeling more separate, more rooted in what we call ego, which is a sense of me, sense of self as something separate. Okay, so how does thought do that? I wanted to talk today about 5 different levels of thought. And I think this is the first time that I'm talking about this in this way, because we talk about thought all the time and how it can help and hinder, but this is getting a little more surgical with different types of thought. So the first type of thought, which is the most obviously creating a barrier of separation, is what we might call charged thought. Charged thought. That means thoughts that trigger a negative reactive response. We think of something that upsets us, or something that happened to us in the past, or that might happen to us, right? Fear or ruminating. These different types of thoughts are what we might call charged thought. So to give a silly example of charged thought, if I go to make a smoothie in the morning and there are no more bananas, and all of a sudden I freak out because there's no more bananas, and I say, "Oh, there's no more bananas!" That might be a charged thought. Okay? So it's not just calmly noticing that there are no bananas. It's like it's all based on time and agenda. Like we have a certain agenda, something interferes with that, and so that triggers something within us, and we get all indignant, we feel all entitled or something. That's a great example, but it can also be many, many other types of things. I'm just giving a silly example. So that's charged thought. The second level we might call functional thought. Functional thought is not charged. It's just stuff we need to function. So for example, after I calm down, I might say, okay, so let me see how I can get a banana. I guess I'll put it on the shopping list, or I'll go and ask the neighbor if they have an extra banana, or maybe I'll schlep out to the store right now. Whatever it is, it's like just planning how to function in time. That's functional thought. We need to use functional thought all the time as well. So those are the 2 types of thoughts that tend to dominate ordinary life. The third type of thought is what we could call contemplative thought. Contemplative thought is the beginning of becoming reflective on what's actually going on inside ourselves. So contemplative thought really has 2 branches to it. One of them is more just straight ahead contemplative, and the other way is prayerful. And both of them are the beginning of creating a separation between between our essence, which is consciousness, and what's going on in our experience, which is thought and feeling. So for example, recognizing the teaching that we can do that, like, oh, I can be reflective on my thoughts. I can be reflective on what feelings are being triggered right now. And I can also become aware that, this is in the context of many other blessings that are present right now that I'm not appreciating. Right? I'm getting all freaked out about the banana, but hey, I'm breathing, right? There are many other blessings that one could become aware of. This is just bringing context into the moment. That's contemplative, and it can also have a prayerful aspect, meaning becoming aware of the potential for gratitude. So that's contemplative. That's maybe the first step into a higher consciousness. The next level is what I would call guiding thoughts. So guiding thoughts is what we can do for ourselves, which is really the same thing as what I do when I'm guiding the meditation. When I'm guiding the meditation, right now I'm doing contemplative thought because we're talking about it. It's in the third person, like the teachings in the third person, we're talking about the stuff. When we get into the actual practice of meditation, or we're doing a healing prayer, for example, either way, we're using thought in order to guide us into a higher perspective or a wider, more vast perspective. Then we become aware. That's the becoming aware of this feeling. That's the becoming aware of this thought. That's the actual blessing. Baruch Hashem. That's the most simple prayer there is. Baruch Hashem for what I'm receiving in this moment, for the life in this body, right? For the ability to even engage in this practice at all. All of this comes in the form of guiding thought, and you can do the guiding thought, of course, yourself. Part of my job is to help with that. But then when we're not in these sessions, in the midst of life, the more you can take a moment to step out of the flow of time and guide yourself into a more awake space, that's a wonderful thing. And that's also, of course, part of the potential of Shabbat. It's the potential of everyday practice, but there's more potential of Shabbat if you put down all of the things that have to do with planning and time, agendas that happen in time. And that's the essence of all the Shabbat practices, really, is that. It all has to do with just minimizing, like reducing our involvement with doing stuff in order for something else later, and just doing stuff that helps us to connect with this reality in the present. And that's a wonderful structure, but it really becomes powerful when we do the inner work in conjunction with the outer structure. The outer structures are to help facilitate something on the inside. And even without that inner work, even just the outer structure can, at least for some people, spontaneously help it, even without much depth in spiritual work. But that's the interplay of outer structures and inner work, that they should be supportive. That's also why we have a practice. I encourage everyone to have a practice every day where you engage in these types of things, guiding thoughts and also spending time in silence, in inner silence. And guiding can be contemplative, simply becoming aware of what is present, and it can also be second person prayerful as well. So that is, which level was that? That was number 4. Number 5, the 5th level, is what we do when we go into silence. The helpful technique is to take a thought and simply repeat that thought in the mind, so that it no longer functions in the way that thought normally functions. Normally, thought is telling us a story that unfolds in time, sentences whose meaning you get after the full sentence is done. Like our minds are kind of fanning out into the future and the past, anticipating and remembering, and so we get a sense of the meaning of language because we have this thing called memory. If there was no memory, you would just hear sounds, you wouldn't understand anything. But what we do is we relax that whole part of the brain when we use words in a different way. So that's when we, for example, in this group, we generally will take the term at-ya, at-yahu, which is a little combination of the traditional atahu, which means you are the divine, and a feminized version, at-ya, you are the divine, but in the feminine. And we combine those. So actually it's not so crucial what words you use. What is crucial is that the mind is, the normal function of thought is put to rest by just bringing awareness into the vibration of the words. You can do it out loud, of course. When we sing and we chant, we're also doing that. And when we come into silence and rest the thinking mind, that's, for most people, that's a little bit easier than just trying to allow the mind to be fully open and spacious and thoughtless without any anchoring thought. But they're both good to do. And What I personally like to do, and it's a suggestion, is to use the tefillah, or as is commonly known in our culture, the mantra. Mantra is an Indian word, but it became popularized because of the popularization of transcendental meditation and yoga in this country. So mantra is almost like an English word now. We know that it's a phrase or a word that we repeat in the mind in order to meditate, but all cultures actually have some variation of this, including Judaism. There are many examples in Jewish history where repeating a word or a phrase or a tefillah or a piece of a pasuk, a sacred text in the mind, is used as a device for meditation, as it is in almost every spiritual tradition. It's just that it became popular with the word mantra. Anyway, we usually will use the word tefillah because atahu is a tefillah. It comes from the liturgy. So I would call that anchoring thought, anchoring the mind in thought. And through becoming aware of what's going on, especially in the first two levels where our minds are just working not in any particularly spiritually intentional way, we can then use the upper three levels, contemplating, how do I relate to what's going on in my experience right now? Oh, I can use prayerfulness. I can also use awareness of. And then guiding, I can actually do it. I can start to say a blessing, or I can bring awareness into what's happening and dwell with the feeling and the impulse and the movement and the texture of the thoughts and the feelings that are happening. And then moving ultimately into a place of stillness with the grounding thoughts. And if you're just walking around, doing things that don't take much mental activity, I really suggest giving yourself the gift of at least certain times, maybe not all the time at first, but at least certain times when you're doing things, especially if they're repetitive, things you do every day that you don't need much mental energy for, use those times for meditation. Use those times to elevate whatever's going on in your mind and heart into a spiritual practice. I hope you enjoyed this episode on the 5 levels of thought. If you're on YouTube, be sure to like the video and subscribe. And if you're on the podcast, be sure to follow for more content like this one. One thing I would like to clarify is that in the first 2 levels, which are called charged thought and functional thought, both of those levels can be up-leveled and transformed through the next 3 levels. We do this first by remembering to bring the teachings to mind, that all thoughts are arising right now in the space of consciousness, and that we can become aware of what's happening in our experience. That's the 3rd or contemplative level. We can then do a process of guiding ourselves out of our thoughts and feelings and into awareness of our thoughts and feelings, and that's the 4th level of guiding thought. Then, if we have some time, we can let go of the ordinary thinking mind and bring a tefillah or a sacred word or phrase into the mind and simply repeat it until we open inwardly into that sense of vastness. At this point, we're no longer simply being aware, but rather we are being awareness. With practice, this leads nicely into letting go of thought altogether, even letting go of the tefillah, and spending time in the peace and spaciousness of consciousness without thought. And that's called meditation. And remember, if you want to go deeper with these teachings and practices, you can get guidance from me and meditate regularly in community by becoming a member of Torah of Awakening. Just go to torahofAwakening.com and you can try it free. All blessings.